Nice to have everyone here. I'm Abby Rose, the CEO at Vidacycle. I'm going to just say a little bit about what we do. We make apps that support observation as a key tool for understanding what works on a specific farm or vineyard. Many of you may already use or be familiar with Sectimenter, which is our app for vineyards. So Sectimenter makes it easy to predict yields, monitor ripeness, understand soil health and biodiversity. It tracks vineyard activities block by block and much more. And in November last year, we actually released the Regen dashboard in partnership with Nicole Masters. And that allows you to benchmark and track your regenerative viticulture journey using the 10 Regen indicators, as well as get tips and tricks from Nicole on how to improve them. So at Vidacycle, we're committed to building ecology, profitability, and beauty on farms around the world. And it's a real privilege, really. We're always exposed to amazing stuff that's happening, but not enough people get to hear about this. So, and especially the real implementation details of a regenerative approach. So today, the Regenerative Viticulture series, I think this is our 7th episode of it. This is really about connecting the conversations, sharing knowledge, and highlighting the work of Nick Paulin and others as brilliant resources if you want to take a more regenerative approach. So just a bit of admin is that please ask any questions in the Q&A area. And if you want to ask a question, Nick and I will be in conversation, and then we will leave about 20 minutes towards the end to go through the Q&A and answer questions. And so, do type into the Q&A area. The question will be visible to everyone, and then others can upvote, or you can upvote someone else's question with the thumbs up button. Okay. So, such a pleasure to be talking to you, Nick, today, Nick Paulin. We first connected when Nick became manager for AONZ Estates, and you'd been doing some trials with different techniques for managing cover crops and burying underpants, counting earthworms, observing soil, and trying to understand what was working to build your soil health. So Nick's been doing regen experiments for many years, and so I'm really excited to have you here to share your learnings and to dig into that a little bit more. So to get going, Nick, if maybe you could just share a little bit about your vineyard and your background to get us.
Sure. Thanks, Abby. Privileged to be here as well. I think, it's pretty exciting to have this conversation. And so my journey to viticulture has been a family history of horticulture. So my great-grandfather started an orchard, stone fruit orchard in Central Otago, where I'm based now, 100 years ago. So we've got a bit of family history here. And then I guess I came to it from an interest in horticulture and wanting to live in Central Otago. No interest in wine when I first started out on this journey, so didn't know much about it. Studied at Lincoln University and was lucky enough to land a job at Felton Road Wines in Bannockburn when I was partway through my study, and that turned into a kind of full-time role. So, and that was the start of their journey to organics as well, and to biodynamic. So 2003, 2004, with them, and seeing that transition kind of cemented to me that way of farming. And I guess fast forward 15 years or so, started with AONZ in 2017. So we have 3 vineyard sites across New Zealand, Lowburn Ferry in Central Otago, and Pyramid Valley in North Canterbury, and a little vineyard in Hawke's Bay. So my role now is overseeing those 3 estates, and based in Central Otago, and still a very much hands-on approach. Our total hectares are just over 20 across the 3 estates, so it's pretty small, but predominantly high density planting, so quite unique for New Zealand in a way.
Amazing. Yeah, kind of a great opportunity really at that scale to be able to do some of these experiments
Yeah.
and really learn.
And I think
So
the advantage I've got is distance from head office. So you know, head office is in Hawke's Bay, so they don't necessarily see what I do day to day, but it's a pretty great environment to be able to, you know, throw ideas out there and try them.
absolutely.
So, yeah.
Like that as a metric for regenerative experiments.
Yeah. Where can you hide them?
Exactly.
Right.
So yeah, maybe we can start with, I know that you really began your journey. Well, you started in this organics and then started a shift to a more regenerative approach within the organic context, of course. And really that began with cover crops as a way to build soil health in the vineyard. And yeah, my understanding is you started, learning about that 20 years ago with kind of 2 cover crops. And then more recently, AONZ, you've got to a place where you're actually looking at 12 species mixes. And maybe, so can you tell us a little bit about, how did you get there? How did you end on 12 species? And yeah, maybe a bit about that journey.
Yeah, so I think that's, like the early days at Felton Road, it was going from kind of doing nothing to doing something, and playing around with like rye, corn, and peas, like quite simple mixes that worked, and you could see what was happening. And then I went to a few courses and YouTube and whatever, talking to people. Came across this thing called cocktail cover crops, and having 5 plant groups in the mix was this kind of symbiotic release of life into the soil, I guess, for lack of a better term. But so sort of saw that, and then, like I said, just no one could see what I was doing. And so when I started with AONZ, everything was within budget, and I just went to a seed supplier and said, hey, look, can you guys build a mix with these plants in it, or these groupings? So those 5 functional groups, or 5 groups of plants were, or are, grasses, cereals, brassicas, chenopod's, and legumes.
Okay, so you're doing every mix with all 5 of those in.
Yeah, as much as we can. And then sort of did that, and then decided, well, and then had a really great agronomist working at a seed company called Kiwi Seeds here in New Zealand, and she came up with the mix. And this is the good thing with working with the seed company is, they've come up with the mix and said something that would work in Central Otago, and we tried it and it worked. So yeah, and it's kind of, I guess, evolved from there. That we did, I think we started with 8 species. It was the first time we did it, and then we sort of settled on a 12 species mix, which basically just has a few extra clovers in it. So yeah, seems to be working.
Mm-hmm. And
Yeah.
I remember you also said you tried a 28 species mix, but you came back
Yeah.
down.
Yeah. So I think, like, I guess the freedom, or not the freedom, but it is the freedom, I suppose, to try new things, is to say, well, let's push the boat out and see how far we can go. Not across the whole vineyard, but let's try a little bit. So I went and got a 28 species mix and planted that, and sort of did every 10th row of a block just to kind of try it out. And like, it worked, but I reckon I probably only saw 10 of those 28 actually growing.
Mm-hmm.
So it was kind of like, well, it makes sense in terms of diversity and lots of different plants, but if only 10 of them grow, you're spending money on seed that may not necessarily do anything. So sort of pulled back on that, and sort of settled on this mix that we've got. And yeah, I guess the management of it is probably the next step.
Yeah, so maybe for the 12 species, can you tell us what your 12 species mix is?
Yeah, and I've got it on I cannot remember the 12 off. So what we've got in it: rye corn and oats, lentils, crimson clover, prima clover, loser clover, there's a Persian clover, tillage radish, mustard, phacelia, alyssum, spinach, and white clover. I think makes 12. Yeah. So, those plant group, and so that mix is based on our drill as well. So, the legumes in there, we can't put peas and beans through our seed drill in the high density blocks. So, if we had a normal seed drill, you could, mix it up. But it's the whole concept, I guess, I'm trying to stick to is that those 5 functional groups: grasses, cereals, brassicas, chenopod's, and legumes. So, yeah, which it's kind of, and it depends on, we switch out a couple of different clover species for Hawke's Bay, but generally that's across the country. That seems to work pretty well.
Interesting. And a little bit about the management of that, because obviously, one of the issues of cover crops is how to terminate them or how to deal with their height and this kind of stuff. So we'll get a little bit into the control more generally, but first, so you're doing every other row with your multi-species cover, and then you're reseeding every 2 years. Is that correct?
Yeah. So again, in the last kind of 5-6 years of playing around with it and seeing how long we can go with that mix. So our equipment for seeding at the moment is a power harrow and an air seeder on top. So we do full cultivation to establish the crop, and started off doing every year, the first couple of years of the blocks being planted. And I guess to put it in context, so 2017 and 18 and 19, we planted a lot of new vineyard areas in the properties. So part of this process was developing new vineyards and leveling out the ground because it was pretty uneven post-planting. But so the first couple of years we needed to cultivate to level, so we chucked cover crops in at the same time. And then so sort of got, did 2 or 3 years of that, and then stopped and thought a little bit about it and said, well, what if we leave it for 2 years or 3 years or 4 years? How long can this mix go for? And so I've got a trial running in one of the blocks where there's a cover crop that's 3 years old, 2 years old, and 1 year old in those every second rows across the block. And what we found is that after 2 years, the kind of regrowth we get kind of tapers off and it reverts back to grass. So that's the kind of the routine we're getting into, is seeding this mix every 2 years, and then the alternate row that's kind of a permanent grass mix, which has got a couple of different grasses and plantain normally in it, trying to swap that every kind of 5 or 6 years. Just depending on how it goes. So we spray on every second row, so a lot of our compaction ends up on that grass row, and so it's a chance to kind of refresh that and then put the access back on the row that's been cover cropped for the previous 6 years.
Got it.
So yeah, it's a wee bit, I guess, for me, I kind of find cultivation as a chance to reset the row and keep things level, especially with undervine cultivation. We kind of chucking soil around under the vines, and it inadvertently spills out. But also in the high density plantings, it's the tolerances with machinery are so tight that we have to be, if it's bumpy or uneven, it makes operating machinery a real nightmare. So yeah, trying to do as good as we can, but knowing that we have to sort of throw a reset in there every couple of years, and just open things up.
Yeah. And also, what have you found kind of is key to establishing that good cover crop for you? Because I think timing is often key, isn't it?
Yeah, timing, especially in Central Otago, for those that don't know, is kind of the most continental part of New Zealand and is the driest and coldest region, and hottest in summer. So what I've found is that sowing this in autumn kind of gives us the best result. And so I try and do it just before we put nets on, so sort of raise-on time, and it'll establish pretty quickly because the soil's warm. We generally get a shower of rain between raise-on and harvest, generally, I say. And compared to doing it in the spring, coming out of winter, the soils are really cold, and if we get rain, it just keeps it cool. So it takes a longer time for the crop to establish. But also that it's growing, it's competing with the vine at the same time in spring for that growth. So, veraison to harvest, the vines are kind of shutting down, and this cover crop can establish, and then post-harvest is there, ready to go. And it kind of grows a little, winter's cold here, so it kind of grows a little bit, but then as soon as things warm up in the spring, we generally get a flush of the cover crop before bud burst. And then that moves into the vineyard growing cycle.
Yeah, got it. And well, yeah, maybe we can then talk about the new growing cycle. So as you're reaching bud burst, and obviously your cover crop is somewhat established, and very quickly, I'm sure, approaching the same height as the canopy, which is not always desirable. And so, yeah, I know you've been experimenting with the effectiveness of crimping versus mowing, and how can you deal with that cover crop at that time. And I think this is where you did your original underpants trial.
Yeah.
So yeah, maybe you could talk a little bit about that, because you did say this was a real light bulb moment for you when you started to see the system could work.
Yeah, because I guess in previous iterations of growing cover crops, they got to a point where they were, too tall or not, they'd done their job, and we just mulched them in, thinking that was the right, creating a mulch. But necessity, we bought a mower, or thought we bought a mower for our new vineyard, and it didn't turn up. So the dealer went into liquidation, and so we had a summer where we had no mower, and so all I had was a cultivator and a crumbler roller, and so I just used that. I thought, well, it was only a hectare, and I was like, there's no point. And it was a high density vineyard where getting a mower to fit was not easy. So I was like, let's give this a go. And then I guess had read up on crimping a bit as well, and had kind of played with it and never really had great success with it. And then, so out of necessity, rolled this block for a season. And then the end of that summer, we had a lady working with us from Quebec, and I can't claim the original idea for this experiment. So Chloe said to me, hey, I've seen this thing in California. They put onions in the vineyard. I was like, oh, that sounds interesting. So we did that in January. So kind of towards the end of summer. and stuck these undies in the ground, and yeah, had the row that was grass species, where the undies stayed intact, and the cover crop species where we'd rolled were pretty much disintegrated apart from the elastic. So was kind of like, well, hang on, that's a massive difference. What's caused that? And then, that's when it was kind of like, hey, actually putting this diverse mix in has made a difference.
Mm.
And then, dug some hole, did some worm counts, that kind of stuff. And, there was quite a significant difference in worm counts as well. So that was kind of the light bulb to say, hey, look, actually retaining and then reading up on the literature on it or talking to other people about it, like having that thatch across the soil surface, retaining moisture, keeping the soil cool, all of the things that I guess I've seen talked about or heard talked about in terms of regenerative grazing of animals, like trampling effect, all that kind of stuff. Um, it it really made sense.
Yeah,
So uh, yeah, and then from there, it's just kind of that's been the catalyst to just keep doing it.
totally. Amazing. Amazing. I think in a way, that's why I really love the regen indicator as well. It's like when you have a visual of the difference, it really like cements on a different level than just like a numerical difference.
Yeah. And so we did so to follow that up, did soil tests that winter,
Mm-hmm.
following winter, and there was a 0.5% difference in organic matter between the grass rows and the cover crop rows.
Wow.
So it was like 4% and 4.5%. So, and within a season,
Yeah.
like it was, and then so it's that was like, hey, this makes sense, and that's from full cultivation as well. So like that's um, you know, cultivating with the power harrow and dropping seed on top to replenish that and have a positive impact by the end of the season was pretty exciting. So
Absolutely. Very cool.
yeah,
Um, and okay, and since then you have continued to do kind of crimping versus mowing trials, to just
yeah,
because crimping is a bit like, from my understanding, many people do try it and then they find it like doesn't work for them, or it's difficult, or it's not quite right. And maybe you could talk a little bit about the difference you're finding and also your crimping techniques that have worked.
yeah. Yeah, so I guess we've kept that access row for spraying and mowing it, but definitely cut back on mowing after seeing what's happened with the crimping. So most of the reason is kind of a cultural thing that the staff get shitty walking through knee-high grass all the time. So, which is fair enough because at the end of the day, we need people to work and to grow wine. So I kind of I normally deal with the complaints for a week and then pull out the undies experiment and say this is why we're doing it, and they're like, oh shit, that's pretty cool. So and we most of our staff for summer are kind of backpackers who are traveling New Zealand, so they're not necessarily from a wine or farming background. So it's it's a really impactful thing to show them. But I get questions from my boss to say why I've got undies in my drawer in my office. So it's good. It's a good fun conversation. But yeah, I think we're trying to. It's getting the timing right for crimping. I think I normally try and leave it as long as I can in the spring before we have a frost event. And if we've got a frost event coming, I'll go out and roll it. And um, we've got two styles of crimpers depending on the width of the rows. And what we've found is there's not a massive difference between the different physical machines, but the the direction that we go can have a big impact. So uphill versus downhill, whether you're and it's normally kind of mustard or rye corn by that stage that's ready to crimp. or oats, that if you go uphill, it kind of bends it into the hill and it doesn't quite go past 90 degrees. Whereas if you go downhill, it kind of takes it past 90 degrees and flattens it into the ground, and seems to be slightly more effective. But and if you're too early, it'll kind of stay down for a day, but then spring back up, which for a frost event is fine because you can kind of deal with a bit of airflow for the night and then it's gone. And I guess we're lucky that we're small, so we're not having to cover 20 hectares the night before a frost. But in saying that, we sort of just try and keep knocking it. Once we start crimping, we just keep doing it. And so probably end up doing 2 or 3 passes across it before it kind of stays down properly. And then what we find is kind of a succession that once the rye corn and mustard and the kind of taller plants are down, the clovers will start to come up through it. So especially in a wet season, you really see clover come through. And then if we've waited long enough, it kind of self-regenerates for that second season. So if the rye corn's gone to seed or the mustard's gone to seed, then we're basically laying seed down into a mulch, and that's where it seems to keep going. So there's some parts of the vineyard that just keep growing rye corn, even though we don't sow it. And as part of a paddock where we just, had some spare seed, we ran out, and it just keeps regenerating rye corn. So, yeah, it's definitely not, and it's definitely not a visual. It's not, for some, it's not an aesthetically pleasing look for a vineyard. So, there's a challenge of aesthetics, and some people think a vineyard should be mown and neat and tidy. But then, that's been one of the pushbacks I've had at times, and then you show the results of the soil health improvements, and then it's kind of like, oh, okay, mindset shift. So, which is cool. Like, it's really cool to see. But yeah, it's definitely in terms of getting the crimping to work effectively, definitely can be hit and miss. But my approach is just to keep knocking it down. And we're kind of like we've set ourselves up with equipment that we can kind of multitask that. So if we're undervine weeding, we can run the crimper. If we're trimming, so like around later in the season and things are still kind of poking up, we can crimp them then as well.
So it's just a multiple a strategy of just keep going over it if you need to.
Yeah, and I think the things that are ready to stay down will stay down, but it definitely needs to be lignifying or going to seed. Like if it's green, if it's a cereal crop that's green, it won't stay down, unless you like put so much downforce on the crimper that it actually like cuts it. So we can fill one of the crimp rollers with water, and that seems to have more of a cutting effect rather than just kind of crimping. And which kind of, I'm not sure about, but we've definitely used that as a tool before a frost to knock some green stuff down.
Yep, got it. Cool. And so I know when we were talking, you also shared that there's kind of 3 things that go together that you found in your contexts really are kind of a recipe for life and ecology, and for the vines thriving and the soil thriving. And the third aspect of that, alongside the cover crops and the crimping, was buried irrigation. Or mid-row buried irrigation. So maybe you could tell us a little bit more about that, and why is that an important part?
Yeah, so subsurface irrigation. When we took over the Lowburn Vineyard in 2017, there was a block that had a kind of derelict irrigation system, And so we had the opportunity to do something new in that. And there's a local vineyard here, Amersfield, who had probably 4 or 5 years earlier trialed it. And seen really great results in terms of keeping cover crops alive, but also reducing the amount of weed growth or competition growth underneath the vines in an organic context with undervine cultivation, sorry. So they, Andre is a great innovator and loves building stuff. And so we kind of saw that and said, well, let's research it a bit, and found one of the local irrigation designers was really supportive of it. So he figured some stuff out and found some drip line that we could bury that's got a little copper impregnated dripper, so the roots won't grow into it. And saying that as well, there's a couple of other people in New Zealand that there's a vineyard in Marlborough that I think's had it for 20 years. So it's definitely been done before. And the fear has always been that in the middle of the row was too far away from the vines. And so we sort of went ahead at like, well, if it's an established vineyard, then hopefully the roots are spreading out anyway. And let's, like putting it closer to the vines meant it would be in the wheel track of the tractor. So the compaction issue of driving on a wet surface didn't appeal. So it was 0.7 of a hectare. So we chucked it in, and probably takes a season to see the difference, to see the benefit. But now have a block that is really resilient to heat stress, and we can get away with irrigating a lot less in summer. So and it kind of keeps the grass alive. So quite often in summer the grass will brown off because it's so dry. And so with the subsurface down the middle, we're finding that it keeps that grass alive and keeps the soil cooler, so it retains more moisture, doesn't evaporate as fast, and the biology is still alive. So all functioning as best as it could. But so the last 2 summers we've got through pretty much the month of January. So from Christmas till the raison, it's about 5-week period of not having to run that system. And the vines this summer we kind of sensed the first year or 2 years ago when I did that, I just kind of seated my pants and left it off and just kept watching it every day and getting really nervous about it, and then kind of succumbing to it at Veraison, going, I don't want to risk the crop. But this year used a pressure bomb or a stem water potential measuring machine to check the vine water status as we went every week as we went through summer. So I had a kind of a data point to back my observations up. And so yeah, we basically trundled through the hottest part of summer with 5 weeks of non-irrigation. For context, it has water frost protection in the spring, so it does get a pretty decent drink if we have a lot of frost events. So we would have this year probably put close to 200 mils of water on pre-flowering for the kind of first 6 weeks of the season, just because we had quite a few frost events. But then basically from then on could hold it back, and still trimmed it. Probably still trimmed it twice, so it wasn't lacking vigor. And I think it was just and then it contextually with other growers around the region who were battling to put water on every day to keep up, and comparison, like within our estate, another block of older vines that have a drip line in the, you know, traditional sense along the row above the ground. That was getting water weekly in that same period. So I think what we've found is that having that water mid-row, and sort of we're aiming to get it about 300 mils underground, that the vine roots have found that, and they are living happily underneath that kind of carpet of cover crop. And it's a more efficient way of putting water on as well. We don't have evaporation losses. It's straight into the root zone of all the plants. And even with that kind of active cover crop, the vines still get what they want. So by that stage of summer, we kind of see, with the crimping, we see the clovers start to come through. So you kind of have this, you know, there's a thatch of dead rye corn, straw, and mustard, and then clovers kind of coming up through it. And so it's, yeah, it's kind of an active environment with the vines in amongst it. So, yeah, it's proving really successful. It's not a technique for new vines, for new vineyards. We tried that. It didn't work. The water was too far away. So what we settled on was establishing vines with the drip line in a traditional sense, on a wire on the post line, and then after 3 or 4 years, once the vines are established, is switching it into the mid-row. So this winter for us is quite a big project of putting a whole heap of stuff underground. And we did a little bit of Chardonnay last year with it, and definitely saw a benefit, but there's a risk in that transition of the vines not getting enough water. So I made the mistake of not changing the irrigation program to suit that. So I left it on the surface. We normally run it for 2 or 3 hours at a time. In the first year of subsurface of 4-year-old vines, they started to yellow off. So very quickly went back and ran the thing for like 24 hours to go to a real big soak, and that kind of solved the problem. But yeah, there's a risk in that transition period, but then once they're kind of through it, the vines seem to find that water and kind of live happily in I guess in a more resilient way. And it's just nice not having to. There's a few fears about leaks and not seeing where there's problems, but you soon see where there's a leak.
Yeah, massive oasis.
Yeah. Or you walk along and it's kind of squelching. So
yeah, it's not
but yeah,
that.
in terms of the whole I guess system approach of it, those three things are probably now we're kind of expanding that subsurface program. That really seems to be making a difference.
And you can really see it's like a context for life. And I guess that in a way, that's what regenerative is like, how can you build more of a context for life to thrive? So it makes a lot of sense. Just before we go to questions, I just have one more thing I wanted to cover, which is, I know that at the end of last season, you did some sap testing for the first time. And so, can you say a bit about why did you start that, and what happened when you did do it?
I think many hours of driving to Canterbury, listening to John Kemp's podcast about sap testing, and actually having a talk from him a couple of years ago. There's a little group of us that got him on a Zoom call for half an hour, and that was the most intense, mind-opening half hour in terms of regenerative viticulture, or regenerative farming in general, but just hearing his thoughts on it was pretty inspiring. So we found a lab in Hawke's Bay that can do the testing for us, and just wanted to give it a go. So it's been an idea that's swirled in my head for the last 3 or 4, 5 years, and really just wanted to see test it out. And it's, I guess we're lucky with the freedom to do these things. And yeah, so Hawke's Bay, the context for this is in Hawke's Bay last year, really dry summer. We've got a vineyard in the Gimlet Gravels that's, struggles for nitrogen traditionally. I think we're pushing the boat out for the local growers there in terms of doing cover crops and stuff, but that's probably a whole nother hour's discussion there. But we started to see some nitrogen deficiencies towards Veraison, so thought it was a good opportunity to try this. So sent off a block for testing and came back with really low molybdenum, moly, if for short, but and quite high, and a decent whack of nitrate, like nitrate nitrogen was low, ammonium nitrogen was quite high. So we did a little side by side trial, and we put on some moly and some organic nitrogen fert as well, and yeah, saw an instant difference as soon as we put that molybdenum on. Instant response. So kind of, in equal, and there's no data to back this up. We retested it and saw what we'd done in terms of retesting, and the nutrient levels didn't really change, except the moly came back up on the test, but the vines changed color completely. So and like digging into that, molybdenum is a really important component of that nitrogen cycle. So I think, wouldn't call it an enzyme, but it's a kind of, I guess, a catalyst in that equation. So having that missing meant that we could solve the problem without, whacking on a ton of, whacking on nitrogen fertilizer and potentially causing other issues with fruit quality or what. So I think it's something that, we've sort of dipped our toe in the water there, and we want to definitely do more of it, and just see what we can do. I guess take a lot of confidence from what John says, managing whatever he is now. His company looks after millions of acres of land, and is completely confident in saying that plant health can be solved, or plant diseases can be solved through nutrition. So I think if we can get to that space, maybe not completely eradicate fungicides, but I think if we can reduce the reliance on them, that's something that we should be aiming for as an industry, because it's too easy to say, oh, let's just put more on. We've got a challenge with mildew, let's just keep adding copper. But personally, that doesn't sit that well with me. So, but in saying that, there's an economic reality as well, that we can't just kind of spend a lot of money on testing and not get a result either. So there's I think there's a balance somewhere between doing the testing and doing the nutrition program alongside some reduced input of fungicides.
Yeah, because you said that you only put on, it was like 500 grams of molybdenum.
Oh, it's yeah, tiny amount. And interesting kind of side note, we put it on with a drone. So that's one thing as well, I guess, that's starting to sit on the horizon for us, is drone spraying, and being able to cover ground quickly and efficiently. Because high density vineyards are notoriously slow. So spraying from above makes a lot more sense. Yeah,
maybe we can jump into drone spraying, because let's see, there are a few little questions in the chat, but I can jump into the drone spraying because we might as well while we're here. Obviously, for a while people have been saying, oh, drones are the future. And I think the industry has kind of pushed back and said, well, somewhat. There's a
Yeah.
balance to be struck here. So maybe you could talk a bit about your experience of introducing drones and where it's worked and where actually you like tractors at the same time as well.
Yeah, I think so. We've been trialing it for 2 seasons now, and in Hawke's Bay, and kind of spurred on by looking across the fence at our neighbour who has a really steep terrace vineyard, and he did a full season of drone spraying in 2023. Yeah, which was Cyclone Gabrielle in Hawke's Bay, and had a good result. Had no disease in what was probably one of the most challenging years in the last 30 in Hawke's Bay. So we decided let's give it a hoon, and started off with a lot of, and we've probably kept it going as well, is using spray papers to check coverage, and the water rates are a lot lower, which is kind of one of the interesting things to get your head around. But felt confident with the coverage that we were getting early season, so kept it going. We had quite a comprehensive disease monitoring program as well, so guys are out there every week checking, and we knew the hotspots. So I started this in Hawke's Bay, which is kind of 3 weeks ahead of the rest of our vineyards anyway. Got to flowering, started to see some challenges with powdery mildew, and so in Chardonnay especially, so pulled out the tractors and started spraying as a kind of cleanup round. But then because we were 3 weeks ahead of the South Island, we sort of said, well, let's take a proactive approach here and just tractor spray through flowering. And then, talking amongst ourselves within the company, we sort of said, well, the next most critical thing is pre-bunch closure, so let's just commit to doing that with the tractor as well, and then continue on with the drone. So did that, and we left kind of 10 rows on each property as a bit of a trial, and had some, ended up with powdery in those rows. So kind of proved a point that the drone's not 100% the solution, but in combination with the ground-based sprays at those kind of critical points, we got through a season. We spent a lot less time spraying. So the drone takes, it's about 40 minutes a hectare, and we to spray with our little crawler tractors and the high density is about probably an hour and a half.
Okay.
So, about half the time, and used a lot less product as well. So we sprayed on a kind of concentration factor thing and used probably half the amount of sulfur that we'd normally use. And yeah, it seems to work quite well in high density because the rotor wash from the drone kind of pushes back off the ground, and because the vines are so close to the ground that you actually surprisingly get coverage underneath the leaves and in the bunches. So, but there's a lot of learning, and it's like I say, it's we're not I don't think we'll rely on 100% drone spraying unless something terribly goes wrong.
Yeah, we
There's
just
a
have
bit
a
of,
question. Sorry, go on.
and canopy management, we sort of took a really proactive approach with trimming and leaf plucking, and we started to see issues towards the end of the season where we'd kind of held off trimming. So there's a way to do it. It's just thinking about it, but some really positive indications that it can be successful.
Totally. Well, and there was a question from Graham Fisher, which says, kind of you answer this, but it seems to me the target area is smaller from above. How do you get decent coverage?
Oh, I don't know if you've seen a helicopter. helicopters sort of, if you see a helicopter spraying, you can see the vortex that the rotor wash creates. And it's the drone's flying 5 meters up above the canopy. So it's quite high, but the force of the 4 little rotors on the drone is incredibly strong. And it sprays out, I think it was 4 meters, a 4-meter swath. So it gets quite a lot of coverage, but it's just physically the force of those rotors pushing the air draft into the ground and back up creates that rotor wash. And I've had friends or other colleagues in the industry doing it in 2.5-meter rows and being probably less successful than us. And I think that's part of it, is because in a 2.5-meter row, there's so much space for that to swirl that it doesn't hit anything. Whereas in our little 1-meter rows and 1.2-meter rows, it just, it's absorbed by the leaves because everything's so close.
Okay, that makes sense.
But it's different, and it's a challenge in the wind. Like if there's any more than kind of 3 or 4 k's of wind, it blows it off. So we've got a WhatsApp group with about 1,000 pictures of spray papers. So we learned a lot this season, and in terms of like direction of travel, like across the rows versus up and down the rows, across the slope, up and down the slope. We sort of did all sorts of stuff, and there's not a single answer I can say is what worked best, but there's kind of a combination of those things.
And we had a question from Nick Gill. How does the winemaker feel about the regenerative practices in the vineyard? And how do you feel that the regen practices might influence the wines?
He's pretty happy. I think. Hugh's a man of many words. Not many words, I should say. But what we've found, I think, is that, is that combination thing of the subsurface and cover crop and crimping, when we're putting on a lot less water, so our berry sizes are a lot, where our berries aren't blowing out to these kind of big juicy things. So which is kind of what you see sometimes, some years, if you're pouring on heaps of irrigation, you get this really diluted berry and like big voluminous berries. So we're seeing that like berry size is a lot smaller, and we're kind of like, I guess the health of everything is good. So we're not battling disease as much as we were previously. And I think from Hugh's perspective, it's probably the water use thing that makes the biggest difference, that we don't have, stuff that we're trying to wait to ripen because it's been overwatered, or it's, concentration wise is there already. So, and yeah, I guess in terms of the wines, there's some, wines from this, I talk in the Central Otago context here, the vines that we're, making and selling are off blocks that we've planted and used these kind of techniques from the start. So, it's, crop, the fruit we're getting off 5 and 6 year old vines is pretty impressive. And whether that's, I don't know whether that's the density thing, like because it's a higher density than what's normally planted, or whether it's the combination of cover, what we're doing with soil health. But I think, one of the things with the drone spraying this year has been using less sulfur in the vineyard. One of the comments Hugh made after harvest was that he was, a lot happier with ferment health because we had a lot less sulfur coming through into the winery. And it's been one of the criticisms of organic practices in New Zealand, especially, that we use so much sulfur to try and control mildew that it's creating reduction in wines. So I think working towards that's a really positive step.
Definitely. And Nick added a follow-up question. Totally, we have 1 minute for this one, but how do you manage undervine strip? And I was actually going to ask this as well, because you said yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so we're using cultivation, and my experience with it, I guess in 20 years is, especially for young vines, if you have any sort of competition, it's a real negative. So, yeah, cultivating that strip in other blocks in certain areas we're mowing, like where we've got high vigor, we undervine mow, but generally it's cultivation. So we're doing, I think the, cultivation can be seen as a negative, and there's definitely some negative impacts from it. My take on it is that if I can do amazing things in that mid-row strip and have to deal with cultivating a 300 wide strip under the vines, that's the trade-off for growing an economic level of crop. I think if we left it to, if we didn't cultivate and we had too much competition, we're going to detrimentally affect yield, and sustainability is economic as well as environmental. So we've still got to have a crop that pays the bills. And in saying that, though, like we try to hang off cultivating through the winter. So generally our last pass is end of January, early February, just before the nets go on, and then we won't touch it again until kind of August, September. So it has a 4 or 5 month rest. And we probably tolerate a little bit more, competition than some, but still that kind of strip, just keeping that strip, I guess, aerated and free of weeds through, especially, but really concentrate on getting bud burst clean, and letting the vines get off to a good start. And then as summer progresses, kind of hold off. And the subsurface thing as part of that as well has meant we've probably dropped 2 passes with undervine cultivators. So where we're not irrigating that strip and we're not having weeds germinate, we can kind of, stop cultivating at Christmas, and leave it till just before the nets go on.
Maybe that's or do you think that would ever be the next experiment, is undervine practices?
Yeah, I think I think with the subsurface for sure, I think it's a possibility. And it's we see in, North Canterbury, where we've got old established high density vineyards that are 24 years old. We undervine mow that.
Okay.
So potentially, yeah, there's definitely parts of the high density stuff where vigor is good, if not too good. But I've seen, these vines are only 6 years old. And I've seen a previous trial that undervine mowed after 5 years and yields just fell through the floor. So maybe after 10 years, I reckon I'd be game. But in saying that, maybe that's a psychological barrier that I need to challenge myself and try. But yeah, I think for new establishing vineyards, I've seen too many horror stories with competition. So yeah.
Yeah, totally. And it's all a balancing act. And thank you so much, Nick. We are just at 1 minute past, so I've gone over a little bit. Sorry about that. But I really appreciate your time. And yeah, amazing to have all this detail as well. That's one of the things I think is really missing so much of the time, is it's all very well talking about diversity and cover crops, but to actually hear exactly what people are doing and what those methodologies are is yeah, it's priceless. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, and it's just trying, it's you don't have to do the whole vineyard, but just try something. And I think that's where the learnings come from. Whether it fails or succeeds, you'll definitely learn something.
Yeah, exactly. I'm always learning.